Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DM&E for Peace community, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, the first of a new era of the Thursday Talks. This is our first Thursday Talk after the close of Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium. So a quick thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support over the last few years. We've really appreciated it, and we really look forward to building on the work we've done with them and taking the Thursday Talks to the next level. Like I said, we're back, we're better than ever, and we're excited to be able to showcase the best, most innovative, and greatest learning there is in the evaluation field. My name is Jack Farrell, and I'm the DM&E for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground based in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Roudabeh Kishi and Olivia Russell of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, to lead a discussion on using real-time conflict data for DM&E. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the question and answer section of today's discussion. I'm now going to hand over to today's guests, Roudabeh and Olivia. It's great to have you here. You're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. We're really happy to be here. Honored to be the first slot in your kind of relaunch of these. As you mentioned, obviously I'm joined by Dr. Roudabeh Kishi, ACLED's research director, who leads the data collection, methodology, and management of all analysis and research at ACLED. And then myself, I'm the program director and leading operations and partnership development. Really happy to speak with you guys today and share a bit about ACLED. Particularly, I have a background in DM&E myself and did a short stint some time ago at Search, and so this is particularly an important topic to me, and I'm very passionate about applying ACLED to DM&E. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Roudabeh to get started on presenting ACLED to all of you.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having us. So ACLED is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, like Jack prefaced. We're an NGO collecting information on political violence and demonstrations across the world for public use. While we are now an independent NGO, we were originally born from an academic project. So this means we come from a background of very rigorous and robust methodology. We have no brick and mortar office. We are fully remote. It's very 2019 of us. Our researchers are based around the world, and they code information in near real time. And it's important to note that while researchers are based around the world, they're not field correspondents per se. Information that's coded comes primarily from secondary sources, and I'll get a bit more into sourcing in just a bit. ACLED data are used by numerous organizations, ranging from governments to international organizations and policymakers, to academics, to humanitarian groups and practitioners who integrate data into their DM&E work, which Olivia will touch on more in just a bit. So ACLED is an event-based data set, meaning that information is quite granular as we code by the specific day, the specific location, including coordinates for mapping and spatial analysis, and the specific engagement. So this means that when you download the data, it looks like a spreadsheet, and each row in that spreadsheet is an event. And this structure means that information can be quite flexible to accommodate a wide range of levels of analysis. We cover a wide range of conflict and disorder as well, and actually just released new event types as well as brand new sub-event type variable just last month to allow for more nuanced analysis, which might be a new development for those of you who have been using ACLED for quite some time. So this includes information on battles, including territorial control, explosions and remote violence. So this includes things like air and drone strikes, shelling, IEDs, suicide bombings, etc. Violence against civilians. This includes things like abductions and forced disappearances, sexual violence, riots, including violent demonstrations, as well as mob violence, peaceful protests, including those that are forcefully put down, as well as those that go undispersed. And lastly, strategic developments, which are non-violent events that may have an impact on future conflict dynamics. So accounting for things like mass arrests, headquarters or bases being established, etc. And the examples that I noted are just a few of the aspects of the data that are specifically coded for users. So the sub-event types that we include actually cover a much wider range of specific events. We also include information on a wide variety of groups and actors, and include coding to denote agent type and their interaction with others. And this is helpful for understanding how engagement between various actors might change or vary over time and over space. And lastly, we also include a fatality estimate for events as well. So our coverage of regions varies in terms of how far back it extends for each region, which is a reflection of how we've grown as an organization. We originally began as an African dataset, so coverage of Africa extends back to 1997. Then we expanded to South and Southeast Asia. Most of those countries extend back to 2010. Then we expanded to the Middle East. Most of those go back to 2016. And just a few weeks ago, we expanded to Eastern Europe, and that coverage extends back to 2018. And this year, we're in the process of expanding coverage to South and Central America and the Caribbean, Western Europe, as well as Central and East Asia. And those regions too will all extend back to 2018, and we anticipate releasing those later this year. And this summer, we're actually planning to start a pilot of the US for those who might be interested in that. Regardless of how far back coverage for each region extends, all regions continue to be covered in real time, meaning that new data get published weekly. And while the temporal scope of coverage for each region might vary, all regions are coded using the same standardized and systematic methodology, which means that cross-country and cross-regional comparisons can be made across the data. In addition to extending our spatial coverage, we're also extending temporal coverage as well. So for example, we're extending coverage of Yemen back to 2015 to capture the start of the war, because right now it only extends to 2016. And in addition to spatial and temporal coverage, we're also adding in new aspects to the methodology to allow for further analysis with the data that are already available. For example, I mentioned how we debuted new event types as well as new sub-event type variable last month. Next month, we're planning to release a gender component to the data. So as you can see, we're always in the process of expanding our coverage forward, sideways, in all directions all at once to offer more coverage for our users. So ACLED information comes from a variety of sources. Firstly, we draw from thousands of media sources in over 20 languages, ranging from national newspapers to local radio. We're increasingly using trusted new media sources, so things like vetted Twitter accounts like those of journalists, or trusted Telegram channels. We draw on in-depth reporting that comes from international organizations, so reports from like those from Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or the UN. And really importantly, we benefit from partnerships with local conflict observatories, which can be especially crucial in accessing information, especially in contexts where media reporting is known to be lacking. We have a number of such partnerships, like the few examples that I've included on the slide here, like the Syria Network for Human Rights, or the Yemen Data Project, or the Kivu Security Tracker in the DRC. And partners will share data and information that they have collected with us, which we will then translate and recode into ACLED methodology before integrating into the ACLED dataset. And then in collaboration with the partners, to avoid it being a purely extractive relationship, because that's not what we want, we support their own capacities around doing further data collection, analysis, and visualization of their own work to facilitate a mutually beneficial relationship. So for example, I was in southern Thailand just last spring to train the team at Deep South Watch around data visualization software and analytics so they could apply it to their own work. So for those of you who have worked with other conflict data sets that might be out there, you might be wondering in what ways we are innovative and how we differ from those other data sets. So ACLED publishes data weekly, which is different from many other conflict data sets who often update annually or monthly at most. All information in the ACLED dataset is georeferenced, meaning it can be used in spatial analysis and monitoring. We capture a range of disorder, which is more flexible toward understanding what violence dynamics actually look like on the ground, as opposed to to forcing observations into a static or dated methodology. And this allows for better understanding the various ways in which disorder actually manifests on the ground. ACLED has no fatality threshold for inclusion. This means that disorders such as quote-unquote lower-level violence actually gets captured in our data set, which is important given the ways in which violence actually manifests across many regions, like in South Asia, for example. All information at ACLED is coded by human researchers, not machine coded, which can be susceptible to a lot of noise added to the data. These researchers monitor thousands of sources intensively, with researchers reviewing new reporting daily. Yet we don't rely solely on media reporting, which would leave us susceptible to the limits of media reporting. We benefit from local collaborations, which I noted before, which I think make ACLED data collection quite unique. And lastly, we offer open and transparent methodology to allow users to understand exactly the types of assumptions that they are incurring through use of the data so that they can make their own informed decisions from their analysis. So you can access ACLED data in a number of ways. You can download specific data files based on your needs by date, country, event type, etc. Of interest using the data export tool on the ACLED website, which you can access through the URL noted here, acleddata.com/data. For those interested in API access, data can be accessed through an API call. There's a user guide on how to use the ACLED API that's available on our website. And we also have curated data files available on the website that can be downloaded as Excel files. So these include regional files, like if you want all of our Africa data, or files covering all anti-civilian violence, as well as aggregated files, so including aggregate information like at the country year level, for example. And we plan to continue adding files to these based on what's most helpful to users, so please do let us know if there's something you wish that you could see there. New data, as I noted before, are added on a weekly basis. So each Monday and Tuesday, we release data covering the week prior, so Sunday through Saturday of the week before. And we're also always in the process of updating data if there are corrections or new information that needs to be considered, as well as supplementing data for historical periods if we identify a new source, for example, or establish a new partnership. In addition to the data that we make available weekly, we also have research and analysis that are accessible as well. We provide weekly regional overviews that offer a quick snapshot of the latest ongoings in each region. These are published weekly following each week's new data release, one per region. We publish multiple infographics each week for quick takeaways as well. You can see a few thumbnails of these on the slide here. We also offer reports around latest developments. So a recent report, for example, includes an overview of contentious issues surrounding the Indian elections alongside an Indian election monitor to monitor developments weekly. You can also access briefings offering coverage of specific countries or specific crises. And lastly, you can access the latest working papers and academic journal articles by the ACLED team, given that ACLED continues to engage in academic debates. And I'll hand it off to Olivia now to talk about the potentials for design and for M&E.
Great, thanks, Roudabeh. So as Roudabeh mentioned, I'm just going to highlight a few ways that we've kind of thought about internally and heard users using our data for DM&E. So as you can see, I wanted to start with program design. The first kind of areas we see ACLED could kind of speak to or connect in terms of program design is at the level of kind of selecting target locations and which groups to engage in your programming. So ACLED data can be used to answer questions like, where is violence concentrated? Where is it absent? In the former, obviously, it's useful to know where particular provinces that have the highest levels of violence might be, particular communities. But then on the other side as well, in terms of absence of violence, I know there's a push in the community to understand better where violence is not taking place so that that can be better understood. So while in some cases, when you map our data, it could be that there happens to be a desert there, so there's just no one there to be involved in violence or otherwise, but other times it can indicate lower levels of violence in particular areas that can be helpful to kind of understand particular dynamics across a country. ACLED data can also show where violence is increasing or decreasing. So this can be quite useful for kind of counterintuitive program design, in the sense of, for example, you might have one province next to another, one has quite high level of violence and the other it's lower, but perhaps the violence is escalating quite quickly. So looking at these kind of dynamics can help you to make sure that you're tailoring the programming, so maybe a prevention model for where violence is increasing and escalating. And I think another aspect of these kind of applications is that it can help to challenge entrenched notions about where violence is and where it isn't. So I know in my own programming background, there were often particular communities and provinces where, or areas where programming was kind of applied repeatedly for good reason usually, and there was often networks and implementing partners in those areas. But I think sometimes these kind of data can help to interrogate the reasoning behind why we go to the same communities or the same areas. One thing I wanted to mention as well in terms of locations is that when you map ACLED data, and if we see an example later in the Q&A, perhaps you can see this, you'll see pinpoints obviously on the map for a particular event. And it's important to remember that those events that you see mapped are not the natural or exact location of where the violence took place. So it's where the latitude and longitude drop is, and that means that it's accurate up to the city level, so it does tell you where the violence is taking place. But for example, if you saw a street where there was a cluster of incidents, it's just important to remember that that street isn't necessarily a hotspot, but that is indicating that there's violence in that area, of course. Moving on a bit, these data can also help to interpret which groups should be involved in programming and in what way. So understanding who is involved in violence and what types, emergence of new groups, so to understand new actors that might need to be engaged, and then dynamics and alliances between groups, both for kind of program design and then of course aspects of conflict sensitivity. Getting into activity design, ACLED data can help to kind of give a temporal or geographic signature to what type of violence is taking place in a particular area that can really inform activity design. So for example, you might have a look at the ACLED data and realize that in a particular area, you're seeing violence that's highly dispersed with cyclical battles between local communal groups. So this can kind of tell you something about programming at a kind of very concrete level, in the sense that it means you need to reach many people in many places at once. So maybe media or radio programming is the way to go. You might want to also think about peace agreement monitoring to kind of interrupt that cyclical, repetitive nature of the violence. These kind of things can kind of inform design. And then finally, in terms of program at the kind of proposal fundraising stage, it can help you to build your case for why here and now in terms of a particular program. ACLED data has the benefit of allowing cross-country comparisons, so you can really see why this particular area versus another one, why is it important to implement this program now, and it kind of helps to build that relevance case. And then Roudabeh, if you could go to the next slide. I can't tell if it's gone yet. Great. And then getting into monitoring and evaluation specifically. So I think one of the more obvious applications is context monitoring. So to see new protest movements or new types of violence emerging, it can be difficult to see this when you have kind of a ground level view sometimes and are relying on local data and information. So it gives you ability to zoom out and kind of see upticks in violence that you kind of might not catch just from watching the news and speaking to people locally. Next, in terms of conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity, I think that's one of the most obvious applications of ACLED data. So really to highlight and understand microdynamics, look into actors, and then to use this as a quantitative tool or data set to kind of couple with surveys or qualitative data like key informant interviews. Next, in terms of risk assessment, I think everybody who works in the field at least knows there's kind of no substitute for local knowledge. But in terms of risk assessment, I think ACLED can be quite useful in the sense that it gives a quantitative measure, and particularly for HQ or regional teams, it can kind of help to frame conversations and questions with the local teams to kind of motivate a back and forth discussion about safety. And then potential indicators, so I talked about context monitoring, but I think there's also some potential for outcome indicators. I had an example here, something like number of incidents of violence against civilians by police in a particular area. You might be able to see how, depending on the scale or scope of a project, something like that could be applicable to security sector reform programming if tailored correctly. And then don't want to take up too much time, but the last bit there, in terms of evaluation, I think that there's applications as well. I know when I did evaluations in the past, relevance could be something that was difficult to engage with systematically to make a really good case for why a particular program continued to be relevant throughout the duration of the project. And I think looking at ACLED data allows you to have a kind of systematic external data source outside of whatever you collected in your evaluation that can kind of corroborate arguments that you're making. And then in terms of effectiveness, this gets back to context monitoring. So really understanding how the outcomes that are taking place from the project or that are being attributed to the project are connecting to those overall processes at the societal level. And I think this connects to the last one as well, of course, in terms of impact. So how is your project reflecting or mirroring what's taking place at a broader level, a higher level, and or not. And so it can kind of help guide that discussion and evaluation and help you to kind of have an additional anchor to engage with. And then just moving to the last slide. It takes a minute to update. So from us, that was all we wanted to share kind of concretely, because we're very excited to hear from all of you if there's examples of your applications of ACLED data, and then of course lots of questions. So we just had on the screen there a few emails. Please feel free to reach out to both myself or Roudabeh. Our emails are there, and or the admin emails, kind of like our info emails. You can always feel free to reach out with any questions you have about applying our data to your cases. We've mentioned the website there. I think you guys are familiar with it, but you can also sign up to mailing list. So basically, if you want to get everything that we post in terms of Middle East or Africa or particular regions you're interested, you can do that. And then of course, a quick plug for Twitter. If anyone wants to engage with us on social media, we're always ready and willing. So thank you guys so much for listening to all that we had to share. We're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Roudabeh, for your amazing presentation. Just to reaffirm, I absolutely love the ACLED website. Anybody who is interested in data, particularly around sort of the work that we do, it's a treasure trove. There's so much to get lost in, and you guys also have an incredibly active Twitter account showcasing all the new things that are happening. Hi, everyone in the audience. We're now going to open up to questions and answers. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. Just a note, when you ask your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And as a reminder, these talks are recorded. Tell you what, I'm going to use my moderator's privilege. I'm going to kickstart today's discussion. So it's really exciting to see that you guys are now using sort of new media data to sort of feed sort of your data. How has that changed your steps towards verifying the veracity of a data source? Of an incident? How do you guys approach verification in the first place, and how has the sort of move towards new media affected that?
Sure, I can take that one. So new media obviously is a blessing and a curse, right? It gives you so much access to potentially so much more information, but it comes with a lot of noise. So we have not opened the floodgates completely to just moving into, let's say, a crowdsourcing model, where because that would be quite difficult, as you noted, to determine the veracity of all of those various tweets and messages and things like that. So we go through a process of, before we start using a certain account, vetting who that is. As I mentioned in the presentation, these are often the accounts of journalists. These will be sometimes events that they'll note that maybe don't make it into a full media report on their own, but they are things that they are noticing and reporting on in the areas in which they're active. We are also using information when it can be corroborated by multiple different accounts. We did a project now 2 years ago with the Institute of Development Studies and some partners based in Kenya around the Kenyan election to see the usefulness of using something like Twitter to monitor what's going on and if we're getting more information, and in what ways social media like Twitter can be more or less helpful. And we found that when it comes to reporting right around contentious periods, Twitter does a really good job around capturing where a riot's happening, just as announcements are made about the winner, something like that, which media doesn't always capture, or if it does, it's quite lagged when we get that reporting. But when it comes to times outside of these kind of contentious periods, we've found that traditional media, if you will, is it still reigns supreme in some ways, in that you really benefit from people who are reporting these events that are truly reporters, if you will. They will report exactly where things are happening or who is involved, and all of these aspects that you sometimes miss when you only have a handful of characters on Twitter. So we found that the tweets and things that are most helpful are those that will link to news sources, for example, that will offer further information. So that's kind of been our first dipping our toe into the world of new media. That there's still, I think, a lot more we can do, and we are exploring that, but we haven't dove in completely quite yet, given all the noise, if you will.
Yeah, and I think in sort of the era we're currently in of the fake news, I think being extra careful in how we sort of accept this kind of information from social media platforms is important.
Yeah.
The next question comes from Brian Chevalier. Brian writes, could you talk about the academic project that started ACLED and how that moved from an academic project into reality?
Sure. So this was originally the dissertation project of our executive director, Clena Raleigh. She's now a full professor at the University of Sussex. And this is in its very early stages, started out as her dissertation project. It involved determining certain methodologies that are reflective of what we currently use now. And it had to be coupled with some ground truthing, things like that at first stages, to ensure that things that we're collecting from media, to what extent we can draw conclusions based on things happening on the ground, etc. Then for quite a few years, it was an academic project. Like I said, she's a professor, so this was funded through grants through university systems, etc. Had a number of her graduate students on it. I myself started on the project many moons ago as a postdoc for her. And since then, it has transitioned into a standalone NGO, like I mentioned. Clena remains our executive director and works part-time with us, still overseeing the organization as a whole. So we still very much have at least a foot in that academic world. Many of us that work at ACLED still have 1 or 2 feet in academia. A lot of graduate students will work with us, given the flexibility of a remote job that's very remote, research-based. So in that way, we haven't deviated completely from being an academic project, but we formally on paper are. And it's allowed for us to have some of us, such as Olivia and myself, who are full-time employees, who can really push the project further, which has really been an important step in kind of the current expansion that ACLED has seen in recent years. So we're just about to celebrate our 10-year anniversary, technically, of when ACLED first started, though we've only been kind of this standalone NGO for a few years, where we've been really pushing forward on the expansions. And like I said, originally the project was an African data set. That's what Clena's dissertation originally was. That's why those data go back the farthest. But since then, we've been kind of applying what we've learned across each region to expansions for new regions. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Congratulations on 10 years. I think the remote working really sort of tends itself to the global nature of a project like this. Um, and yeah, it's exciting to see that your team is based all over the world. I think this is the first time we've ever had people based in Burundi and in the US co-hosting. So it's an exciting webinar. The next question actually comes from quite a few people who have asked if they could hear or learn more about how ACLED and how your data has been used for outcome level indicators for the purposes of an evaluation or academic study.
Sure. So maybe I can just mention that, and it will be a semi-quick response in the sense that I don't know any instances of that taking place. That was more of something that I had been thinking about a little bit in terms of kind of reflecting on my previous life in DM&E and kind of thinking through the challenges associated with determining indicators, generally speaking, for peace building work. And so sometimes that it can be challenging to kind of hone in on something concrete. And then specifically when I was working in Burundi before, I know we kind of missed we did some programming with police. And I think that if we had used ACLED data, potentially that could have been, I kind of reflected on this, could have been an indicator. So unfortunately, I can't kind of speak to a successful example of that. I more wanted to hold it up as a potential, particularly with the new sub-event types that Roudabeh mentioned that kind of get in at more granular levels of violence, so more specific categories. That as well I see as a potential for indicators, so kind of taking those sub-event types and maybe saying, okay, number of a particular type of violence, so violence against civilians, sexual violence, because ACLED is also everything is pegged geographically, so you can really hone in on a particular community, and you might be able to use it as perhaps outcome level could be a little bit too kind of low for it. Maybe it's more of an impact level indicator. But I hope that can kind of answer the question. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of it, but I think it could be explored.
I think one thing I'll add to that, if I could, is that a lot of these, from my understanding, these outcomes or impact kind of indicators might be worked on internally within organizations. And since our data are completely public, you don't need to technically sign up or anything to use the data. We love for users to engage with us and tell us ways they've used the data, or tell us about a way that you've used ACLED for an indicator within your projects, but no one is required to let us know that information. So some of this, us not maybe having a concrete answer to that, is that we haven't had someone reach out and tell us exactly the ways in which they are using it, even if we do know of organizations more largely who are using it. We don't know of the idiosyncrasies of our internal processes.
Great, thank you guys. Our next question comes from Giselle Lopez of Integrity Global. And Giselle writes, ACLED is such a wonderful resource and it's great to see the expansion. Can you talk about how you work with partners that have already been collecting conflict event data, if their methodology or coding of events does not quite align with yours? Do you have any examples of those? We are especially interested in Syria and Yemen.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. It's one of my favorite topics. So like I mentioned, our local collaborators are really a really strong backbone of what we do. When we find new partners, sometimes we will reach out to partners if we've seen their work and are quite impressed. Sometimes partners will reach out to us because they've seen the work we do and they're eager to contribute. Whatever ways we find each other. When we do collaborate, we never mandate that an organization change their methodology to match ours. They are very welcome to continue the work that they're doing in the way that they are. We work with them to understand their methodology. Then we take their information internally at ACLED, and we will essentially translate, sometimes literally if they don't use English, but also translate in terms of methodology what they've been collecting into our methodology. As you might expect, this is quite a painstaking process. but very worth it. And once we translate this information, then it goes through the process of integration into the ACLED dataset, which is another painstaking step in the sense that we go through a very rigorous deduplication process. Some of the events that local partners will report are, perhaps larger events, for example, have been picked up by media reporting or other types of sources we use. So we already have it in our data set. Sometimes the local partner will have new further information to add to that event, so we will update the events we have already. Sometimes if they have exactly the same information we already have, we would make sure to not include an additional event so that we're not duplicating anything. And more often than not, it will result in a lot of new events that get integrated. And we do try to time each of these new integrations of partner data with a release around a joint report or an infographic or something that also highlights the specific addition of their information into the ACLED dataset. So in that way, we definitely don't mandate any of our partners changing any of their methodology, and to date, none of our partners have done that. They all carry on kind of doing their work, because I think what's really important about these local organizations are that they often have really great data collection around their specific mandate around in their area, and you see these pop up in different countries and different regions. And while each of these might be a great standalone data set, they have different methodologies. So you can't compare apples to oranges, and we can't draw comparisons across these different contexts to compare, I don't know, Syria to Yemen, for example. But where we think ACLED's value added is that we have these partnerships, we take the information, we translate it into a standardized ACLED methodology, which is kind of the common language, if you will, across the various organizations. And this allows for being able to draw comparisons between different regions, different countries, etc. So in both Yemen and Syria, we have really important partners that we work with that really shed a light on specific dynamics in those countries. In Yemen, we work quite closely with the Yemen Data Project, like I mentioned, who've been really integral to our Yemeni data collection. And for Syria, we actually have a consortium of partners we work with, and each partner kind of brings their own value added to the table. One might be very good at collecting information around a certain type of violence, or certain, airstrikes, for example, or violence in a certain area, or involving certain actors. And by bringing together all these different pieces, we've kind of sketched out a constellation of things that are happening there. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much for such an in-depth answer, Roudabeh. That was really, really helpful. Our next question comes from Brett Barrowman, who has informed me he's listening with a room full of people at our friends over at IRI. And Brett writes, what challenges do you see around collecting event data in closed spaces, and how do you address them?
Can I ask what they mean by closed spaces? Are these places like without media penetration, or do they mean something else?
I think they mean security, like closing spaces security-wise. So, for example, freedom of the media, freedom of sort of use of social media, for example. I think the closing civic space is more what Brett is getting at here. And Brett, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure. So, I would really point to our partnerships with local observatories. These are often based in the countries or regions where they're covering. So this, really gives us insight into areas where we wouldn't otherwise be able to see what's going on. I think a really good example is work we did with an anonymous local partner in Burundi back in 2015 around the height of kind of the Burundi crisis. Following the mandate, that there was a complete media blackout, and we weren't seeing any information really at all coming out from media around what was happening. But through a partnership with a local organization that was, using citizen journalists that are based, around the country that were reporting events, we were seeing a picture into what was going on. We were seeing like the mass arrests that were happening. We were seeing attacks by paramilitary groups and pro-government militias, things like that. So I think that I would really point to the local conflicts observatories, who are our partners, who who really play an integral role between us not having to rely solely on media. And again, I think that's something that makes ACLED quite unique, because no other conflict data sets kind of have this kind of relationship with local groups.
Great, thank you, Roudabeh. Our next question, and this is a big question, so we're going to use this as the last question of today's webinar, comes from Carrie Huisman, who works at PAX in the Netherlands. And Carrie writes, you mentioned that you're adding in new gender components to the data, which sounds very useful. Can you talk about what types of new data will be available and any potential data limitations you've encountered in soliciting sufficient reliable data around incidents of gender disaggregated or instances of SGBV or gender disaggregated information about victims or perpetrators, etc. I also realized I said data and data in the same question, but please feel free to ask me to repeat any part of that you'd like.
Okay, no, great. So I'm quite excited for the new extension that we'll be releasing next month. It's been a long time coming through a partnership with the University of Texas in Austin. What we will be doing is not a gender disaggregation of the full ACLED data set, in the sense that I don't think anyone can give you that. In that reporting often does not denote, who was killed or how many people were affected. Fatality estimates are quite difficult to give a lot of weight to as it is. So being able to disaggregate those by gender would be something that we would not pretend to promise. What this will be covering will be looking at political violence, given that that's ACLED's mandate, and political violence that is targeting women specifically. So this will not be a sense of the total cost of violence on women. That obviously is much, much larger. But it will be cases in which women are being targeted because of that identity being salient in that attack. So we see cases like women targeted who are running for office, for example. And those cases have often fallen through the cracks, in that we so often define violence against women, in the sense of sexual gender-based violence. And while we are including cases of sexual violence, it won't be limited solely to sexual violence, because women are the receiving side of gendered violence that is not necessarily sexual in nature. We currently have a sexual violence sub-event type in the data, and we define sexual violence largely, so it's not solely rape, but anything that kind of has a sexual nature. And we also include this information for all genders and all ages. So it's not solely women and girls. It also includes men, which are also victims of sexual violence. What the new gender component will look like for those who have worked with the ACLED data set is that it will be essentially a new associated actor in the data. Right now you can see associated actors that are from a variety of identity groups, whether it's around ethnicity or around specific political parties or religions, things like that. So this will essentially be a new identity, which is salient at times when women are targeted in this way. And in that way, it'll be added in to the sexual violence events that we already cover, as well as all other events that we already cover where civilians are the victims. There will be a larger release with this data that will be accompanied by a methodology document, short kind of one-pager to help understand what exactly you can and can't do with the data, so that it's quite clear. Because I know that the inclination is to think of a gender component as being a gender disaggregation of the data, and it won't be quite that. So I hope that answers it, and we'll hopefully leave everyone wanting to stay tuned for that release next month.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you for such an active Q&A today. I really appreciate the audience's engagement, and thank you, Olivia and Roudabeh, for your time. This was a great Thursday Talk webinar. Just a reminder, we hope to have the recording posted later today. So if you're interested, you'll be able to sort of access Olivia and Roudabeh's emails. So if you have any questions about how you can use ACLED in your work, or if you've used ACLED in your work and you want to share your examples, please feel free to get in touch. Next week, we're back That's Thursday, April 25th at 10 a.m. We've got Michelle Hellman, who is a Rotary Peace Fellow at the University of Queensland, who's going to lead a discussion on monitoring and evaluation and learning from the inside out. It's going to be another great discussion. We can't wait to host it. We can't wait for you to be online and continue to engage with you. The registration link is currently in your chat box on GoToWebinar if you want to register now. And otherwise, we'll be sending out more updates via email soon. Thank you again, Roudabeh and Olivia, and thank you to our audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Please do reach out. We'd really love to hear about ways you're using it so that next time someone asks what indicators people have used, we'll have lots of answers for them.
Great. Oh, that would definitely help us. Okay, thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks.
Thank you.